hello everyone. I guess we will get started. My name is Renee Schrift, and I'm with McClanahan Corporation, and I'm the business line director for the agricultural systems. McClanahan is sponsoring your session today with Newtrient. Our session is entitled Carbon Credits, What to Do with them and how they affect the dairy. Your speaker today is Vander Molen, and she is the Vice President of Sustainability and Initiatives and Outreach with Newtrient, and also a longtime associate friend. So I'm glad we're sponsoring this today. So McClanahan has been involved in the dairy industry for quite a while, over 30 years, and McClanahan Corporation felt that this was a good topic to sponsor today and bring to you today at World Dairy Expo because we have a long history with sand separation, and we do impact the dairies on the bedding and the manure handling side, and we've really focused on sand separation for years, but recently we've been focusing not only on sand separation and bedding quality, but how much sand we're getting out of the manure stream, so that way these digestion systems and future nutrient recovery systems can be successful on the back end of the dairy, and hopefully make the dairy some revenue streams to benefit them as well as the developers. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jamie, and she will be talking about your topic today, again, carbon credits, what to do with them, and how they affect your dairy. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Renee, and McClanahan has been a really great partner with Newtrient for several years as we look to evaluate different technologies that might work for farms. So appreciate the sponsorship, and looking forward to talking to you today about carbon credits. This is a topic that there are a lot of questions about, and you hear it in conversation all the time thrown around, are carbon credits and carbon markets the next big opportunity for farms when it comes to diversified revenue streams. There's so much confusion around them. Are they the silver bullet to solve some of the challenges that exist today from the financial standpoint? And what I really want to focus on today is talking about carbon credits and the diversified revenue stream that they may provide. I think it's a really promising potential for dairy. And what I want to focus on, we'll kind of focus on three things today. The first is just helping you better understand, carbon credits 101. What do they mean? What are some of the lingo that's being used so you can better understand when you hear some of these conversations what people might mean? Why is there so much interest in dairy and agriculture when we talk about carbon credits? And where's the opportunity specifically for dairy? And lastly, as you approach this potential market and opportunity, what are some of the kind of risks and rewards you should think about as a farmer? And what are the top questions that you can start to ask as it relates to your farm? So we're going to start very beginning. What are carbon credits? So as we look at this kind of image over here to the left, there's two opportunities that we talk about a lot when we talk about reducing carbon on the farm. So you have your farm over here to the left, and the two types we talk about are capturing carbon and avoiding emissions. So capturing carbon is probably the most common one that you hear about, which is improving soil health and carbon sequestration. But then you also have an opportunity to avoid emissions, to reduce your carbon emissions on the farm. And that translates virtually through an exchange to a carbon credit that could be sold to a buyer. And we'll talk more about the potential buyers in just a bit, but I wanted to kind of lay the framework for what we're talking about today. And there's two paths to determine the value of a carbon credit that you often hear about. And the first is carbon insets. So this is reducing emissions within the dairy supply chain and offering farmers incentives to reduce those emissions. So if you look at the image, very top, you have the dairy farm reducing their carbon emissions. This is down through the supply chain. The supply chain purchases the carbon credit at a cost that goes back to the farm, but that carbon reduction and the resilience of the supply chain is still there. So that credit really is kind of sitting within the supply chain, and it builds the resilience of the supply chain. It's all within the dairy industry. So that's insetting, right? Someone within your own dairy supply chain is purchasing that carbon credit. The second kind of path that we often talk about to determine the value is carbon offsetting. So carbon offsetting is when you sell the carbon credit outside of your own supply chain or outside of the dairy supply chain. So there is a external company, and it could be the transportation space, outside companies that are actually paying the farm for the carbon reduction. And the most common one we probably hear about today, which we'll talk more about, is the California transportation and credits that come out of California. So these are kind of the two different pathways to determine the value. Again, the in-setting, so you're selling to a dairy company within your supply chain, or you're selling completely outside. And that carbon credit really stands with or stays with the external company. And I think those are two really important distinctions to understand. As we move through today, you will see that the whole carbon space is incredibly complex. I won't necessarily differentiate between carbon insets and carbon offsets with all my examples, but I did want to kind of lay this framework as we got started because I think it's really important to designate these two. So let's talk a little bit about what is driving the markets. Probably the number one question we get from farms is, will this market be here in 5 years? Will it be here in 3 years? When should I take that step forward? Is the money there right now? And I think, in order to kind of understand that, we need to talk about what's actually driving these markets that we see today. The biggest one is it goes completely back to the consumers. Consumers are expecting brands to have sustainability commitments and to help them achieve sustainable lifestyles. If you look at this chart, 70% of consumers want to see company sustainability practices to be more visible. 81% of global consumers said it's incredibly important to implement programs and have those in place and communicate them. Consumers want actually companies to help them live a more environmentally friendly life in their daily lives. And they want to associate the brand that they go to the store and buy with a healthier lifestyle and a more sustainable lifestyle, right? They don't want that environmental guilt gap that exists when they purchase a product. And they expect companies to invest in sustainability over the next year. And, we say this is table stakes now because this is definitely not something that's going away. We questioned during COVID from Consumer Insights, would we see less interest in the environmental space? There are obviously a lot of other concerns that came up over the last few years. Would consumers kind of back down from their feelings on sustainability and become a little less aggressive? And the answer is no. They, if not more than anything now, that continues to be a driver. They continue to want to see companies making these changes and to be vocal and transparent about that. So all the way down to the consumer, this drive for the environmental changes are not, this is not changing. This is not going away anytime soon. We'll continue to rely on that as a driver of these markets. And you can see it all the way up and down kind of the supply chain through investor groups who are looking to invest in companies who have sustainable portfolios. If you look at the dairy supply chain companies, the amount of companies that have set goals, I feel like a day doesn't go by that there's not a new company setting aggressive environmental goals and being very vocal and transparent about that. Global dairy leaders and all the way up through countries who are setting goals. So this pressure to lower carbon emissions, again, it's only increasing, it's not going away. So just to kind of summarize the drivers of the market, I think it comes down to three things that we just talked about. Companies are setting aggressive goals and they're seeking to green their portfolio. And if anything, a lot of these companies have set goals and now they're in the oh shit phase, how do I actually make a plan and get there before 2030, before 2040, before 2050? Those seem like it's a long time away, but it's not. So just the continual setting and trying to reach these aggressive goals. Increased regulations on certain sectors. So we talked about California, you've probably seen in the news lately, their very aggressive kind of transportation goals to become carbon neutral by 2045. So these transportation kind of regulations that are happening primarily in California, but other states as well, help drive these markets forward. And then the last one is increased support from government programs. So you probably have seen a lot of news come out about climate smart practices and the support from the government and certain programs and funding. This is really exciting because they're showing their support. Government, funding won't necessarily build markets, but it'll help kind of get the markets started and get the tools and technical assistance that farms need to access these markets. So a couple are the Inflation Reduction Act, the Climate Smart Commodities. These, all have been announced over the last year and really are building awareness and excitement around this space. So if you were to kind of look up and down the different drivers, I may not be able to say this is going to come to fruition in 5 years or 6 years or 7 years and this will be accessible to every farm. But I think what we're seeing is the funding and excitement is definitely there and only continues to increase. So I wanted to give some examples of the type of markets. So when we say markets, who are we talking about and who's actually buying these carbon credits? The first example we'll talk about is Microsoft. So last year, Microsoft purchased about 2 million in carbon credits from Land O'Lakes farmers. And this was primarily cotton, soybean, and wheat farmers, but covered over 100,000 metric tons of carbon was sequestered through healthy soil. So this was a really positive initiative that was undertaken, and I think they're actually potentially in their second round of enrolling farms for this program. Another example of a market that you see a lot of farms participating in, and I will say this is probably the most successful example today, is California's low carbon fuel standard. And you'll often hear people say LCFS. So this continues to be, to this day, the largest regional carbon credit market. It has been incredibly successful in driving carbon reduction across the entire state. I think today there are 50 to 60 digester projects that are currently being built, and over 300 digesters on dairies today as well. A lot of those feeding into this renewable natural gas pipeline and helping to kind of reduce the carbon emissions in California. So this is exciting, an opportunity that a lot of farms are tapping into. And you can see from the map, although California has the most successful program and up and running, we anticipate that other states might follow suit. So I think there's similar type legislation or programs that are developing in Oregon, New Mexico, kind of over in the East Coast and Washington. So something to definitely keep an eye on. I think these type of programs and similar LCFS programs will potentially develop over the next several years. And then airlines. So this is probably one that we run into the most. I know I went to purchase a flight a couple weeks ago, and I got a pop-up that said, would you like to offset your flight? I think it was about $10 I could pay to offset my carbon emissions for a flight that was going across country. And this, a lot of times, if you read into some of the airline industries who are working to both reduce their own emissions and help their customers reduce their emissions through the flights they take, a lot of this money goes to programs around the world. So it was, donate $10 and you will help deforestation in South America, or you will help water quality issues in Colombia. So there are a lot of different programs that you can kind of pick and choose if you're thinking about offsetting. But airline industries have been incredibly aggressive at helping not only themselves offset, but also their customers. And then wanted to touch back on this as well. So Inflation Reduction Act and Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities, like I mentioned, the government programs are really positive and a good kind of signal as we look to approach some of these markets, because they will provide a lot of the tools and resources that farms need to access these markets. So I think that they'll provide funding for technical assistance and things that need to happen at the farm level for farms to access the program. So the more that we can kind of support some of the funding coming out of the government is really positive, because they're complementary programs. And you may have seen a couple weeks ago, or maybe it's been a week now, the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities was announced, the first round of winners. And I think there were 7 dairy projects totaling in over $240 million. So a lot of funding, and that's all toward how can they help develop the adoption of climate smart practices and spur some of those markets. So that's really positive. So you'll see a lot more programs kind of coming out of that funding. All right, let's now talk, what does this all mean for dairy though, right? We've talked about the drivers, the type of markets that exist. What does this mean for your individual farm? And I think it's important to kind of start here. So if you look at this graphic, what we're looking at is the opportunity for carbon reductions, or this is actually the carbon footprint of a dairy farm today. And percentages that kind of align with each area of the farm. So you have, feed production, the manure management practices, enteric methane, and energy. And when we talk about the farm's footprint, those are kind of the 4 areas of the farm with the biggest impact and associated kind of percentages of those. When we talk about that, though, we also need to think about these are all of the opportunities for a potential market. Any area that you can reduce carbon is also an area where you can capture kind of carbon credits. Although not all of these are kind of developed, we'll talk about the eligible practices that you can get into markets today. These are all potential areas down the road where you could obtain credits. So if you kind of look at feed, no-till and low-till farming cover crops. This is probably the top practice that you see, carbon sequestration today, participating in a carbon market. That's on the feed side. If you go down to manure, we just talked about anaerobic digestion. That is a huge opportunity. So turning your manure into biogas, that is a huge market opportunity. Moving up to enteric methane, it's probably further down the road, but we see feed additives that are heavily researched and shown up to potentially 20 to 30% reductions. That could be an opportunity down the line to participate in a potential market if you can show those reductions and verify them. And then energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency. So what's unique about dairy farming is you really have to take a huge comprehensive view of your farm because although a lot of row crops participate in carbon markets today, they've got kind of one piece of the farm. If you look at a dairy, it's the entire farm from enteric to manure to energy to feed that we need to think about before participating in potential markets. So those are all opportunities to reduce your carbon. All right, so talking about the types of services, these are probably the most common that would be eligible for a carbon market. So you have soil management to the left, which we just covered on. You're reducing your emissions through crop management. Feed additives down the middle, so reducing the methane that kind of cows burp. We know that the cows' burps cause a lot of the methane and the enteric emissions at the farm level. So that's a huge opportunity, and that can be done through feed optimization, feed additives, which we just talked about, and then producing renewable energy at the end through an anaerobic digester. Wanted to give some examples of farms and practices that are capturing carbon credits. So, here's an example of the biofiltro technology, which I just had the opportunity to visit a couple weeks ago in Washington. And they're really eliminating lagoon-related methane emissions. So they have over 30,000 square feet, and probably more because I think they're growing, of worm beds, which completely eliminates a traditional manure lagoon. And so that's where you're really capturing that credit by eliminating the lagoon-related emissions. And then mitigating up to 30,000 metric tons of CO2. So that's a great, amazing project. This is Austin Allred. His farm is in Washington. Like I said, I had the opportunity to visit, and it's an incredibly cool technology that's being used today to capture methane emissions and participate in markets. The worm. So outside of their farms, they have these massive kind of worm beds that runs, so the manure slurry runs through the worm beds. And that process alone, through like the castings and just having the worms improving the soil, actually there's a cleaner water quality that comes out of that, and then they don't actually need a lagoon. I'm chopping it up very quickly so we don't get into all the, I'm happy to share more though. They have a great handout that I can share that really gets into like the science of how things are done. I cannot, I would again have to look back their handout. I want to say they have like 3,000 to 5,000, so it's a little larger. So they were expanding, they've had really great success, and you can read about it. It's Biofiltro. So they have some great resources too that I can definitely provide. So and then this is a project, Larson Dairy down in Florida. I think they are getting ready to launch. They may have had the ribbon cutting, but it's replacing fossil fuel with biogas. Like I mentioned, this is one of the biggest opportunities and markets that we see today. There are over 350 dairies currently building or running digesters, and 90% of those digesters are now being developed just for RNG. And again, this is renewable natural gas that is sold into the California pipeline through the Low Carbon Fuel Standard program. So in the end, it does create carbon reductions on transportation fuels in California. And then I think a really cool stat that EPA AgStar ran is, looking ahead, as much as 10% of the renewable natural gas in the pipeline could potentially come from dairy digesters in the future. And again, that's a potential kind of a down the road, but really interesting to see how big of an impact dairy can have in this space given if the market's there. So you can see when a market shows up, like the LCFS market, there are a lot of projects that have taken place. And again, this is the most successful one we see today. And then I think we mentioned this quite a bit, but practicing no-till farming and low-till farming. So this is a lot of numbers, and I'm not going to go through the numbers. I hate when people say this and they have a slide like this, but just wanted to point out a couple of things. So your potential revenue from carbon reductions, and I want to get down to the example of managing your manure. Now, again, this is one data set from one specific farm with 3,500 dairy cows, and I believe it was in Wisconsin, that we looked at the avoided manure application cost back in 2019. So, it might be slightly off still, but we included equipment, labor, utilities, services, and management, and found that managing manure is about right under $200 per cow per year. So it's a pretty high cost if you think about how much farms are spending on managing manure. And again, this is an example of one farm, so I don't want to make a blanket statement. But I wanted to show this for this purpose. So although there are costs associated with adopting practices and technologies to reduce carbon and manage your manure, and there are some financial incentives in there, if you move over to the right, in the end, there's actually an opportunity to gain when stacking carbon credit potential and other type of profit streams. So you've moved over and you've got the reduced annual cost of managing your manure, which is reduced through practices and technologies that are new, but then stacked on top of that, you have opportunities to participate, if you adopted a digester, in LCFS credits, payment for carbon reductions, manure-based products that come from the technologies, like fertilizers, that could be sold into a market. And so that green box is really key as we talk about carbon markets, because sometimes it's not enough to just have that, to participate in that one market. You need to think about, as a farm, how can you stack different benefits that exist out there. So maybe you're reducing your manure management costs, but you're also able to now develop a product that could be sold into a market if it exists, or there are credits that can be stacked. So it's really kind of a, how can you stack the different financial incentives game. All right, so I don't want to be Debbie Downer and talk about the challenges, but I think it's important to talk about the complexities and the challenges that exist in the space today, because there is a reason that 97% of farmers who were surveyed by Trust in Food are not yet ready to participate in carbon markets. How many of you had heard of carbon markets before? Most of you, okay. So 7% of them said they haven't heard of them. 31% are kind of evaluating, patiently waiting, kind of seeing what happens with the market if it continues to increase. And 3% of participants, I think it's supposed to have words there, but I think just said they would not join, and 59% are not joining unless there's some changes. This was done this year. You can pull the report from Trust and Food's website. The data may have been collected last. It was definitely, the report was published in the last few months, so it's fairly new. And then how important are the following criteria to carbon markets? So this is a lot of the kind of complexities and concerns that farmers spoke to. What is the annual payment and the amount per acre? What credits are for pre-existing practices? This is, again, the biggest thing that we get is like, what is the opportunity for farms who have already done a lot? You know, I've made a lot of changes. I've adopted practices. I've adopted technologies. I've been an early adopter, and now I'm left out of a program. What does that mean for me, and how can I still participate? They want minimal paperwork. Don't we all want less paperwork, right? That's completely understanding. Support from a trusted advisor. I think there's not enough technical advisors out there to kind of, you know, help each and individual farm, because each farm has such unique, different, you know, business styles and unique capabilities and unique practices. So it's really a farm by farm support that needs to happen. Ability to use your software. I want to hear from a farmer like me who has used it, but you can see actually from this page, only 3% of participants have actually participated in these markets. So it's fairly low. If you think about the type of farms that have participated, I think it's between 1% to 3% are actually livestock farmers that overall that have participated in this market. A lot of the sectors who are participating today are in the deforestation world. So this is, again, very new. And they want a connection to their ag retailer. So overall, I would leave with, carbon markets, we're gonna go through questions, but as we think about some of the challenges, they're promising, but they're probably not the silver bullet. Some things I think we need to talk about is they're incredibly complex to navigate. Most of the markets that exist today, probably in the dozen to 2 dozen range, came online in the last, 5 years, around 5 years or less. So these are very new. There's a lot of inconsistency between the markets that needs to be navigated, and you as the farmer need to ask those questions. Again, you need to stack together multiple benefits on the farm for this opportunity to really be realized. The growing credibility within the program. So again, it's new. A lot of these programs are still developing, figuring out what works best. And then criticism of the environmental benefits with environmental groups. So I would guess this bullet is not new to anyone in dairy, that you receive criticism from environmental groups. But this topic is heavily criticized because there are a lot that believe you shouldn't be able to kind of take on reductions and sell that either within or outside your supply chain, allowing someone else to potentially add carbon to the atmosphere. Your reduction shouldn't make up for theirs. So there's a lot of criticism in the space, and it also goes back to it's inconsistent. There's not like one organization that's monitoring this and ensuring that all of these carbon credits are verified and credible within the industry. So again, it's new. These things are being developed. So there's a lot of holes and opportunities for criticism from environmental groups. I think we talked about a lot of this. No universal precise measurements of reduction. The contract duration between each kind of market varies quite a bit. So you as a farmer need to think about, if I sign up for, it can range from like 15 years to 100 years. If I sign up for a 15 to 20 year contract, what does that mean for the future of my farm? I'm getting into this new business deal. Do I have a succession plan to continue this business deal? Those are pretty lengthy contracts. Another thing to really look at as you explore different markets is the acreage minimum. So there definitely are opportunities for smaller farms, but some markets come with kind of a minimum. This is the minimum amount you can enter into a market. And I would encourage you to look at that as well, even if you were a large farm, to potentially think about diversifying your acreage as you look at the different programs. The look back period, so again, that's I've done a lot on my farm and I've made changes and now I can't participate in a market because there's no look back period. And this is something that definitely the markets are evolving on, hearing the feedback on this, but it's something that needs to be explored. And data control and privacy is one other one I want to bring up. Ensure you're asking the questions about who's controlling the data, what's the privacy, how's it being used. All right, getting to the questions that each of you should ask, and I think, again, we've touched on a lot of these. What are the payment periods? Is it an annual payment that I will receive? Am I getting paid for the practice and the technology or the actual outcomes, the verified outcomes? What is the payment amount that I will be receiving that's built into the contract, and does that adjust at any point, or is that a standard amount? Minimum acreage, it's important to ask about the locations that are being offered as well. Data requirements and data ownership. Who owns that data? Who has access to the data? Who sees the data throughout the process, and what are the expectations there? When is the program start date and when is the program end date? Some of these programs are, like I said, are very lengthy. And then the last one is who pays for the monitoring. So to be part of a carbon market and program like this, there is a lot of monitoring and monitoring costs that go into it. Each kind of practice needs to be monitored and verified and certified and make sure that it's able to be sold as a carbon credit. So it's important to ask what that process looks like, who's conducting it, and who's paying for it in the end. All right, what can your dairy do today with all of this information? And I know this was just a 101 introduction. This is a topic that the more you explore, kind of the more complex it gets. But it's definitely one to stay on top of. So takeaways, support opportunities for farmers to access these markets. It's important that we support the government programs that provide funding and the programs that are making this or bringing this to life in the carbon market space. Evaluate and question the solutions and impacts for your farm and the future markets. So it's good to question everything. Have an expert that you can talk to. I don't know if a lot of you are part of, there are probably cooperatives or your cooperatives in your area that may have some information on this and can kind of help you evaluate where the resources are. Keep your options open. Farmers always ask, like, should I participate right now or should I kind of wait? Should I adopt this practice now or should I wait until the market's more evolved? I think it's important to take your time to explore. Again, I don't think this is something that's opening and closing and it'll be gone in the next couple of years. We talked about the drivers. These markets are only increasing and the opportunities for dairy to provide reductions are increasing. So keep your options open and know that more will be coming down the pipeline in the future. Stay curious about how your farm can kind of diversify beyond milk. We've thought of milk for generations as kind of the main product and commodity, but think about how these type of markets in the environmental space, you could diversify your revenue stream. And I will say we're talking about carbon today, but there are a lot of markets that are developing around water quality, around biodiversity. So this is not the only kind of topic, although it's moving quickly since the global conversation is around carbon. There will be opportunities in the future to potentially monetize other environmental benefits coming off of your farm. And we tell farms too, even when you get into kind of different contracts and selling your renewable energy kind of credits, make sure that you're not in the contract selling all environmental benefits from that specific project because of the fact that there could be carbon credits, water quality credits, biodiversity credits. Keep in mind that this space is only going to continue to expand. Talk to your trusted advisor. If we can give farmers probably one, give you one big tip right now, it's record, record, record. The more that you're recording and have down, the easier it is to get into some of these conversations and see where your potential lies. and talk to a farmer who's doing it. We know that it's new, and there's probably not a lot of farms who are capitalizing or monetizing from the carbon credit space, but there are some out there, and I'm sure you can connect with them. So make sure you find out from them, what are the issues you're dealing with? Do you have a lot of paperwork? What's your contract duration look like? Is it long? Is it short? You know, what kind of pricing are you getting? So make sure you have those conversations before kind of committing to a market. And before closing out, I just wanted to give you a little bit information about Newtrient and what we do. So we provide support and services to dairy farmers. What we're really focused on is this left side of the screen. So we're working to kind of conduct farm-specific assessments. And then we actually have technical experts that work with farms and provide expert recommendations on kind of next steps. And so there's a variety of different ways that we do that. If you are considering a solution, a technology, we've evaluated over 300 different technologies. We're a third party who wants to work closely with the farm and make sure they make the best decision. So you can visit our website, newtrient.com, and we can connect you via phone or email with an expert who's happy to have a conversation with you. And I stole the thunder from this slide. So if you want to talk to an expert, again, we're here. We have experts on our staff who understand kind of the market potential, but also technology experts and who can help you as you look at the footprint of your entire farm. What are some opportunities that may be there, and how can you think about taking that next step? All right, I was going to open up for questions during the session, but then we moved kind of fast. So anyone have any questions? Yep.
Are you familiar with any companies that are looking for the production of anaerobic digesters for herds less than 2,000 or so, those smaller scale dairies that want to participate?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so the question was, are you looking at or know of any companies that have potential digester opportunities for farms smaller than the typical, what we see is like 3,000 plus, 2,000 plus size farms? The answer is it can be done, and there are digesters that in the New England area that have identified a market for their energy. And I know of one who has a partnership with a local university. And due to also incentives in the state, I think in Vermont, there are a couple of small ones. So it can be done. It all depends on if there's a market on the other end to kind of pay for the increased, the high technology costs. We can talk to you. I can get my my colleague Mark, who is the digester expert, if you want to give me your card, and we can definitely talk to you about options there. But it's possible, and I would say also looking down kind of the road at future opportunities. We talk a lot about kind of the electric pathway and future electric opportunities to fuel electric vehicles, which could be an opportunity that would be open to much smaller farms. So I think there's a lot more to come that would help, you know, drive the size of that scale down. Yep.
So what happens to all the carbon credits then, especially go outside of the dairy industry? Will the dairy industry get credit for that in all of the media?
Yeah.
Or is that going to end up with the companies that buy the credits?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. What happens when dairy farms, if they were to sell their carbon credits outside of the supply chain? So, for example, if they sold into the low carbon fuel standard market in California, what would happen to those credits? Does the farm get a claim ever that they are net zero or carbon neutral? So that gets into a very complex carbon accounting discussion. If you ever Google carbon accounting, you'll be lost for about a full weekend just reading about it. But it's really interesting, and the answer is basically if you're selling outside of your supply chain, it is not something that you as the farm can claim, right? So you could talk about the fact that your farm is providing, X amount to create a greener pipeline or to create more renewable natural gas in a positive way. But as far as kind of reporting for your specific farm, you could not say that your farm is net zero or sell a more net zero marketed product. because once the carbon credit transfers over to the buyer owns that credit, right? You're selling your credit to a potential buyer outside of your supply chain. If it's within the supply chain, it's a little different because you are improving your entire supply chain, and there's some back and forth on if, could you claim that or not if it's within. But when you're selling externally, you couldn't necessarily, you're selling that credit. You're selling your right to talk about that. Yeah.
At the moment, what is the price of the credit?
She asked, what's the price of the credit? So that could range anywhere from $1 to $50 to potentially more. It's really comes down to like the $1 million question of what are people willing to pay for that today? If you're selling within the supply chain, it's what are companies willing to pay for, if you have a company within your supply chain that comes forward, like a Starbucks or a Nestle or someone else, what would they be willing to pay for a carbon credit? But I would say that typically ranges between kind of $1 and $50. Some programs play kind of a standard $20, but it ranges, yeah. Over here in the front.
Curious on the feed additive side. I've got a number of clients in Australia that were looking at this process, and the claims coming out from a lot of the the additive side on the methane reduction. There's some pretty wild claims, and there was a meta-analysis released, I think last week, that basically said exactly what you said, between 20 and 30%. Some of these companies are claiming 90%. Now, if a dairy client of mine was to connect to that carbon credit, and you talk about, there was a point there, look backs, how long into the future, like if the technology keeps improving, we can get better monitoring on farms, say in 5 years' time, we've sold a credit today saying, oh, we claim 90% reduction. They come forward in 5 years' time and go, no, that's actually only 25. Who's going to have to pay that back?
Yeah, and that's really interesting. So he's speaking to like the fact that feed additives, which are not available necessarily, at market right now for most farms, what happens right now when they're claiming, anywhere from 10 to 30% carbon reduction potential, but the research keeps getting better, and we keep getting better at measuring. I was at a farm in Idaho last week, and we use this technology that basically you put into the soil and you figure out like how much is it actually capturing, and it's done like a couple times a day for months, and you're trying to figure that out, but the research gets better and the tools get better, and that improves. So what happens when we find out maybe it actually can reduce 60% or 70%, or maybe it's less, maybe it's 10%, and then kind of who pays that back? I think that's an interesting conversation, and I don't have the answer today. I think that's probably something, again, that needs to be figured out in this complex space that's really new. But yeah, research is definitely something, we need more research. We need to understand dairy's ability to sequester carbon and what feed additives would really do. And so the research takes longer to come through than the markets are moving. Yep. Yeah, so who's verifying the credits? There definitely are third-party verification companies that will go out and do the verification. It ranges how they all the markets actually conduct the verification and who does it and how often and what they're looking at to verify. So you can actually look up like verification companies and see who they are, but it's, again, that's another, it's a little all over the board based on the market. Yeah, so there are kind of like the gold standard or programs that have been put in place to help provide guidance in this area. I would say it's helpful and it continues to evolve, but it's not all directly kind of applicable to some of the projects that are underway right now. So there is kind of there's no universal way, but there is some guidance out there on how to, undertake carbon accounting, where some of the boundaries lie for how things are accounted for. So yes, there definitely are things that are like programs that are evolving and guidance that's evolving. Yep.
What's the working life of an average digester at this time? What type of technical staff is required on a daily basis? And then finally, what about payments from the utilities for
All right, so the average lifespan of a digester, do my McClanahan friends? I would have to ask my colleague Mark this. He would probably, I don't have the average off the top of my head. The technical staff that's needed, I would say that probably varies too. When I visited farms, it seems like they have at least one full-time or another kind of part-time person. Does that sound about right?
Sounds right.
Like two people, probably, on site, kind of helping run some of this. Even when I went to visit kind of the biofiltro, which is the worm technology, there were a couple people who were on staff helping run the technology and the process. So I would say a couple people is probably about average, and that may change as the technology gets further along. But
What about payments from utilities for gas put in the pipeline?
payments from utilities for gas put in the pipeline. I don't have all the details on that. I know there are some like really good programs in Vermont, like the Green Power Program, which ran for many, many years, where utilities were paying the dairies for energy. But I wouldn't be able to answer that question directly. Yep.
A couple weeks ago, the government came out with $2.8 billion in climate smart funding around a lot of claims. What do you see the long-term impact on that as far as opening markets?
Yeah.
5-year program. Any thoughts around how that the implications for this longer term because of that money?
Yeah, so he's speaking to the Climate Smart Commodities program that was just announced. Really exciting funding coming in the way to increase adoption of climate smart practices. And they ended up, I think, increasing the amount of funding that they provided quite a bit. And there were, like I mentioned, I think $245 million going toward dairy in 7 specific dairy projects. So this is exciting because it's going to help, and its intention was to help provide access and help farms approach these markets through something that we talk about is missing a lot, which is technical assistance, right? Like, how can farms figure out where they are today from an assessment standpoint and what steps they need to take? How can we get additional technical assistance out there? Making sure farms have assistance across the entire farm, not just agronomy. So it's really about building up the resources for farms. I don't know that it will necessarily, it won't create any markets itself, but it'll fill a lot of the gaps that the markets have in helping farms figure out how they can take next steps and what needs to be done on the farm level. So I think it'll provide that assistance to farms that they need to realize the markets. Any other questions? Well, I hope we've given you enough to be curious about the topic of carbon credits. And there's so much more that we could share. We could get into a 10-hour conversation about carbon accounting. But hopefully this was enough to give you kind of the basics. And I just want to leave you with, this is incredibly promising. It's exciting. It's also new, and there's a lot to be figured out. But it's important to kind of stay on top of it and make sure you're reaching out to people to ask the questions, because I'd love this new revenue stream to be an opportunity for many of you farmers. Thank you.
Before you leave, I just have 3 things. Number 1, again, thank you, Jamie, for the insight on carbon credits, where they are now, where they're going in the future, and how we can all pull this together and continue to grow this and educate ourselves. Number 2, don't forget to fill out your form for World Dairy Expo, the survey. That's important to them and how these things are structured and gives us good feedback. And number 3, and maybe most important, there are vouchers at the McClanahan booth outside in our booth in the trade mall for a free grilled cheese and a chocolate or vanilla milkshake of your choice. So as a thank you for being part of our session today. So please make sure you stop by and get your voucher. Okay, thank you.
Ooh, nice. That's a nice giveaway. What?